Hello, everybody. Welcome to Matt Connarton Unleashed, the television edition. So nice to have you with me, and got a lot to talk about today. Before we really get rolling, a quick programming note. Tomorrow, I will be back here. I'm going to be a guest on Jane King's program, New Earth Lifestyles. So I'm very honored that Jane invited me to be on that. So that's actually at the same time as this show, just Thursday instead of Wednesday. So if you're watching this live on Wednesday, this will be tomorrow at the same time. New Earth Lifestyles. Jane and I will probably be discussing hypnosis and hypnotherapy, which is a big part of how I make my living. And I also do Reiki, and we'll get into that stuff as well, I'm sure. So that'll be really cool. Jane, of course, has been a guest on Norm and Friends many times over the years. That's kind of how we met. So New Earth Lifestyles is kind of a spin-off of Norm and Friends in a sense. It's the Laverne and Shirley to our Happy Days, or the Jeffersons to our All in the Family, or the Enos to our Dukes of Hazzard. Yes, I realize nobody remembers Enos except me. It didn't even make it a full season. And then Enos was put back on Dukes of Hazzard. Childhood memories. I've never spoken with another human being who even remembers Enos. But I did. I watched it. So that'll be tomorrow, New Earth Lifestyles. And if you don't see the show live, if you can't see the show live, I will, it does replay just like this show does several times. And I'll mention the replay times tomorrow night on the radio edition of Unleashed. And Jane also does post all her shows on YouTube. So I'll let you know tomorrow night on the radio edition on the Dr. Kevin Radio Network. I'll talk about how else you can get to the show if you're not able to see it live tomorrow. So you get even more of me this week, which is great news for all those of you who wake up every morning and go to sleep every night thinking, I've got to get me more of that Matt Connarton. There just is not enough of him. But there's plenty of me to go around. So I'll be back here tomorrow. Today, also too, I want to apologize. I do enjoy some, shall we say, politically incorrect humor at times. And last week I'd made a comment about, I forget if it was on, it's kind of a blur. Wednesdays get to be a blur because I'm here for several hours. But I'd said something about the Redskins, the controversy over the Washington Redskins and the name. And I said, and I was just kidding, but, I said, I don't see the big deal, but maybe if I were Native American, I would have a problem with the name. But then again, if I were Native American, I'd be drunk and wearing a headdress right now. And I did hear some negative feedback on that. Again, I was just kidding around, but some people take that stuff pretty seriously in this very PC world that we live in. My token Native American friend, Chief Running Water, did reach out to me. He called me. First, he sent a smoke signal, but I didn't see it. So then he called me and he said, you shouldn't make jokes like that. That's not, that's not right. That's hurtful. And I said, why are you calling me? Don't you have a casino to run? And so finally he just he said, okay, I don't have time for this. I have to go. And he said, oh, and then he hung up. So I do apologize to anyone who took offense, and to my friend Chief Running Water. He's from the Hi How Are You tribe. They say, though, there is kind of an unwritten rule that with humor, you can make ethnic jokes as long as you're somehow a part of that group. So, for example, Jews can make Jewish jokes, and that's fine, and blacks can make black jokes, and that's fine, and blacks can make jokes about white people, but white people can't make jokes about black people, so there's a double standard there, but that's fine. Comedy has all these sort of unwritten rules. So as far as me making a joke about a Native American, I did go on that site, Ancestry.com, and it turns out, I did a bit of research, and it turns out that I may, in fact, this is unconfirmed, but I may, in fact, be 1/64th Native American. So I think that counts. At the very least, it should get me into a really good school for a big discount. But, trace it back. I may, in fact, be a descendant of the Smackahoe tribe, which is funny in a way because I'm allergic to wearing jewelry. But anyway, so I do sincerely apologize for anyone who was upset. Also, too, speaking of people being upset, tomorrow when I do Jane's show, I'll get to see Ginger Farrer, host of Leveling Your Playing Field, because her show is right after Jane's show on Thursdays here at MPTS. It used to be immediately before this show, and then she moved her show to Thursday just to get away from me because she, I guess, hates me and hates Norm. And several weeks ago, Norm, of course, Norm Moody of Norm and Friends, was a guest on Jane's show. And apparently there was an exchange between Jane's show and Ginger's show where Norm told Ginger, you know, hey, have a great show. And Ginger's reply to Norm was, go to hell. So tomorrow, just as an experiment, just to see what will happen, I'm going to say the exact same thing that Norm did to Ginger when my path will cross with hers between shows. I'm going to say, Ginger, have a great show, just to see if she actually says the exact same thing and tells me to go to hell. So I think that'll be just kind of a fun experiment, because I don't know, you know, did she say it to Norm because she hates him and hates me and whatever? Or is that just kind of, you know, some people have these sort of set programmed responses to certain things. Like if someone says to me, hey, how's it going? I just, without even thinking about it, my automatic response is, oh, pretty good. How are you? Doesn't necessarily mean that things are going well or that I even necessarily care about how the other person is. but you know, that's just kind of my automatic response. I don't even think of it. It just comes out. So maybe that's how it is with Ginger. Maybe when someone says, hey, have a great show, her automatic response is, hey, go to hell. And she doesn't mean anything by it. It's just what she says. You know, that might be her way of saying, thanks, I'll do my best. It just comes out differently. So I'm going to wish Ginger a good show and just see what happens. Not that her telling me to go to hell will prove or disprove anything regarding theories. It could mean that is her set response, or it could mean that she hates me. I certainly don't hate Ginger. I mean, we pick on her, and that's why there's all this animosity from her. But you know, I think she needs to lighten up. It's all done with love and affection. I have enormous respect for Ginger, and I think she's a beautiful person, a beautiful woman. I mean that sincerely. If she were much younger, I'd probably ask her out, to be honest with you. So much love and respect for Ginger, and I look forward to seeing her tomorrow and to see if she, in fact, tells me to go to hell. So if you are watching the show live, of course, if you're you may already be there, but if you're watching at ipmnation.com/MCUTV, we do have an active chat room there that you can communicate with me during the show. I'll try to remember to keep one eye on it. Of course, too, we have links to the Facebook page, Twitter, all that good stuff, and all the times for the show. You can also call us if there is a phone number on your screen and you're watching live. You can call that number. If there is no number there, it means you're not watching live, so don't call that number. Because if it's not live, I'm not here. You can also send us a text, and that also is at ipmnation.com/MCUTV. Also, too, please like the Facebook page for Matt Connarton Unleashed if you haven't done so already, as well as for ipmnation.com, which is on your screen. And there's also Twitter. You can get at me anytime on Twitter at ipmnation. So, as is so often the case, you know, there was a time, it seems to me, that summertime was kind of a slow time in politics. You know, the dog days of summer, you know, Congress wouldn't be in session and there just wasn't a lot going on. I mean, there's always things going on in politics, but it seemed like summer would kind of be the slow season of the four seasons. That certainly is not true lately. It's definitely summer out there. It is quite warm, and there's always plenty going on, plenty to talk about lately. I want to, of course, the elephant in the room, the big Hobby Lobby decision at the Supreme Court. We'll get to that in a moment, but something I saw right before coming in today to do the show, and this won't take long, but it's something that drives me nuts. And if you're a regular viewer, or a listener to the radio edition, you've heard me rant about this probably many times. But here it is again. This thing keeps rearing its ugly head. This is from HuffPost. Arthur Delaney wrote this. It says, welfare drug testing takes effect in Tennessee. Let me read this very quickly. It's a very short article, and then I will explain for the uninitiated why this is so infuriating, annoying, pointless, and stupid. Poor people in Tennessee better get ready to forfeit bodily fluids if they want welfare benefits. A new law taking effect this week allows the State Department of Human Services to screen applicants to the Federal Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, known in Tennessee as Families First. The testing regime is not as harsh as, it says regime. The author meant regimen. The testing regimen is what it should be, is not as harsh as the one in Florida famously deemed unconstitutional by federal courts in 2011. If Families First applicants answer yes on a 3-question form about potential drug use, they'll be referred for urine testing. If the results are positive, according to the state's implementation plan, the applicants will only be cut off if they fail another test after 6 months of treatment. Florida, by contrast, simply made every single applicant pee in cups at the outset, made applicants pay for their own tests, and canceled their benefits if they failed. Courts halted the program, saying Republican Governor Rick Scott's blanket testing violated applicants' constitutional right to privacy. You think? That's not my big problem, though, but we'll get to that. Tennessee and 6 other states that have passed welfare drug testing laws since 2011 have tried not to repeat Florida's mistakes. Still, the Tennessee chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union is not happy about the new requirements at all. Hetty Weinberg, director of ACLU's Tennessee chapter, said on Tuesday, quote, "This law singles out limited income people and requires them to submit to humiliating and intrusive searches of their bodily fluids because they need temporary help making ends meet," unquote. Weinberg noted that research shows that TANF recipients use drugs at a rate no higher than the general population. TANF is the acronym for the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. I want to read that sentence to you again. This is important. Weinberg noted that research shows, and by research, it's the results of these drug tests in the states where they've done them, where they've implemented this ridiculous program, shows that recipients use drugs at a rate no higher than the general population. In Florida, just 2% of welfare applicants gave the state dirty urine before the Florida ACLU successfully halted the program with a lawsuit. That is a very important piece of information right there. There's a little bit left here, and then we'll come back to why that's so important. Mississippi was also supposed to start drug screening welfare applicants this week, but civil liberties advocates there persuaded the state to delay implementation. Even as the war on drugs has lost public and political support, interest in making the poor pass drug tests has surged. Since 2011, dozens of states have considered implementing new drug testing laws according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, and congressional Republicans have pushed new proposals at the national level as well. Republicans love this. Conservatives love this kind of stuff. Drug testing welfare recipients. In some states, they wanted to drug test unemployment benefits recipients. This is my problem with it. It's not the stuff about it being a violation of privacy and all that, although that is troublesome. But see, here's the thing. I can almost understand the logic of saying, look, if you're going to accept money from a taxpayer-funded program, we're going to make sure you're not wasting it on drugs. There is a certain logic to that. Here's the problem. Conservative Republicans love this, but this whole concept, this whole program violates 2 conservative principles. Number 1, it violates the concept of being fiscally conservative, fiscally responsible. Why? Remember this sentence? Weinberg noted that research shows TANF recipients use drugs at a rate no higher than the general population. In Florida, just 2% of welfare applicants gave the state dirty urine, blah, blah, blah. In every single state this has been implemented, it has been a miserable failure. It doesn't save money, it wastes money. Why? Because it turns out that such an infinitesimally small number of these people actually test positive for drug use, because the whole idea is if they test positive, they're disqualified. You kick them off the welfare rolls. They don't get any of our money. Here's the problem. such a small number of these people test positive that you don't save any money, you waste money because drug testing is very expensive. I know, I used to work for a company, I was a manager at a company where new employees would come in and we'd have to send them for drug testing. I knew how much it cost, and it was a lot of money to drug test everybody who came in the door for a job. This is very expensive. This is an expensive program to administer, and in Florida, Rick Scott took a lot of backlash when it turned out that the program was wasting millions of dollars. This is not a fiscally responsible thing to do, number one. Number two, the other conservative principle that it directly violates is the concept of small government. We can't be growing our government. We need to be shrinking our government. We need to be cutting back on this and on that. Well, by adding another component, this adds an additional component to the welfare system. This grows government. You're adding another layer of bureaucracy to this program. That is an expansion of government. So two conservative principles are directly violated by this. And it's like I said, it's a miserable failure. Everywhere it's been tried, it ends up wasting a massive amount of money. And yet, no matter how much money is wasted, Republicans, the party of fiscal conservatism and being fiscally responsible, no matter how much money this crap wastes, they're still pushing for it. They're all about it. And I'm sorry, but there's only one conclusion I can draw from that. And I've said it before and I'll say it again because this sounds terrible. And I say this with respect to all my Republican friends, but I don't know what other conclusion to draw from this other than Republicans, when they see an opportunity to kick poor people when they're down, they just can't help themselves. What other reason could there be for this? If it wastes way more money than it could ever possibly save, and it expands government, then why do it at all unless you just really, really, get off on harming poor people and humiliating poor people? I hate to think that that's really how Republicans think, but what other explanation is there? Why would you do something if you're a Republican? And if there's any Republicans watching who want to call in and explain it to me, I'd love to know what other explanation there is for this. But this program doesn't work. It wastes massive amounts of money. And I know there's an attitude out there because I hear it all the time, oh, those damn dirty people on welfare, they get their welfare checks and then they just use it to buy drugs and to buy their sports cars and go out for steak dinners and lobster and, because there's these strange misconceptions and this demonization of poor people that goes on in this country where some people assume that absolutely everyone who gets any kind of help from the government is bilking the system and is living large, and we're just giving them thousands of dollars a month, and they're living in a high-rise apartment and driving around in a sports car and just living the high life without having to do anything. Of course, if you personally know anyone and know anything about their lives, anyone who's actually been on any kind of government assistance, you would know that, of course, that's not how it works. That's not how it is. Yes, there are people who bilk the system, who work the system. There always has been. There always will be. But that's not the typical person. Also, too, Republicans are completely oblivious to the phrase working poor. There is such a thing. That actually makes up the majority of people who get any kind of government assistance, the working poor. People who are working, people who have full-time jobs, people who are actually out there doing their best to support their families, not sitting at home on the couch watching Ellen and leeching off the government, but people who are actually doing the best they can, but it's still a stagnant economy and they need a little extra help. So they depend on the government for a little extra help to take care of their families. The working poor, working as in they have jobs. They just don't quite make enough to make it. That is the bulk of who gets help. But Republicans just seem to hate poor people so much that this program gives them an opportunity to kick them in the face and they just can't help themselves. And I do understand the political advantage to it. Granted, it turns off people like me. I'm not a Republican, but I'm not a Democrat either. I'm an independent, and I have voted for both parties in the past. But they're not interested in appealing to people like me and winning me over. They're more interested in, as we've seen over and over, take the Tea Party, for example, they're more interested in energizing their base, getting their base all worked up. And the base of the party loves this kind of stuff. They love it because they totally buy into this idea that poor people suck, they're just lazy, they're bad Americans, they're leeches and losers, and it sucks that we have to pay for them to live these, what are actually very lavish lifestyles. And it's crap, it's BS. And this stuff infuriates me. And they hate poor people so much, and they love beating up on poor people so much that they are willing to directly violate their own conservative principles, either because they're so blinded by their own hatred of poor people, or they're just so oblivious and completely lacking of any self-awareness to even connect the dots in their own heads that this does violate those conservative principles. So I hadn't planned on opening with this today. I wanted to get right into the Hobby Lobby thing, the Supreme Court decision, but I saw this and I was like, oh, this will not die. This drug testing crap. Unbelievable. I remember when that was going to be introduced in New Hampshire, and I remember seeing Facebook posts from Janine Nodder, who she's never been on this show, but she's been on Rock, Paper, Hand Grenades. And I like Janine. I enjoyed our discussion with her. That was a few years ago. That was back in the early days of the show. But and we're Facebook friends, so I see her posts. But I remember her posting. She was all excited about, we might be doing this in New Hampshire and how great it's going to be to kick those lazy poor people off the welfare. And it's just ignorant. And like I said, it's if you're someone who votes Republican because you think they're the party of fiscal conservatism, take a close look at some of what they do. They're certainly more fiscally conservative than the Democratic Party, but that doesn't mean they always make good choices. We certainly found that at the national level, at the presidential level with George W. Bush. He was no fiscal conservative, certainly. Bill Clinton was more fiscally conservative than Bush was. Might even be able to make that case about Obama as well being more fiscally conservative than Bush, because the deficit's actually gone down under Obama. I know Republicans don't want to hear it, but that actually is fact. All right, let's get to the Hobby Lobby thing. So they ruled, the Supreme Court. Oh, got a text from Norm. He says, then a person that looking for a job should not be forced to do a drug test to get a job either. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't have an objection to employers drug testing people. I mean, I think it's silly, but, I'm a free market capitalist. Everybody can do what they want as far as that goes. If that's part of the gig, it's part of the gig. I do know that where I used to work, I always found it was silly. I mean, I was a manager at a store that sold music and movies, and, to be, this policy was not still enforced when I left that company. They did eventually ditch it because it cost a lot of money, but I always thought it was bizarre. I mean, but I don't necessarily have a problem with, for example, if airlines want to drug test airline pilots, not necessarily a bad thing. But drug testing welfare recipients is just ridiculous. So the Hobby Lobby thing, believe it or not, I actually have mixed feelings about this, and that will probably surprise some of you. You probably assumed that I was just going to come down pretty hard on the Supreme Court decision, but my feelings about it are complicated. Let me explain. Oh, someone's calling me while I'm on the air. Not calling the correct phone. So here's the thing. I try really hard to respect everyone's religious beliefs and whatnot. I know it doesn't come across that way because I do spend a lot of time ridiculing organized religion, but that's because I feel that organized religion has very little to do with God and spirituality and is really has everything to do with politics. Having said that, this is where it gets complicated for me. I think that everyone should have access to contraception. And I think that if conservative Christians, pro-lifers, want to be so vehemently pro-life, the smart thing to do would be to also be vehemently pro-contraception. But they're not. But we'll come back to that. Here's where it's complicated for me. As liberal as I am in some ways, I do have some conservative attitudes as well. I'm uncomfortable with the government telling employers what they are required to cover in these healthcare plans. Doesn't mean I necessarily think it's a bad thing, because I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. But the conservative in me is uncomfortable with it. Having said that, and that is why I don't completely discount the Supreme Court's decision on this. Having said that, we have a modern Republican Party that is with a Christian conservative base that vehemently opposes birth control. Now, that statement on its face, even to a lot of conservative Christian Republicans, may sound a little ridiculous, but and some would say, oh, there goes Matt. He's apparently signed on again with the whole war on women concept. Of course, we're not anti-birth control and we're not anti-contraception. We just object to the government forcing a company to include it in an insurance package. But here's the problem. What we have learned in the last several years is actually, while no Republican, except for those who are the most reckless, like, what's now become a classic example, of course, Todd, legitimate rape Aiken. I can imagine him coming right out and saying something like this. But no Republican who has any sort of political smarts and wants to protect themselves politically at all is going to come right out and look you in the face and say, yes, we oppose any type of pharmaceutical contraception. Any kind. They're not going to come right out and say that, but that is their position. See, here's the thing. They say, life begins at conception. Now, if life begins at conception, that means that the pill, the most, literally the form, I forget what the technical name is for it, but, we just call it the pill, the most popular, most widely utilized, dependable form of birth control over the last several decades. They believe the pill causes an abortion. They believe that because what the pill does is it prevents implantation. Now, if these folks believe that life begins at conception, not at implantation, because what happens with the pill is it interrupts. You've got conception and then it interrupts that next step in the process before you get to implantation. So by interrupting, by their definition, by how they see things, if life begins at conception, then by preventing implantation, the pill, using the pill, kills babies. Now, if you look at any kind of survey, if you look at any of the polling done, overwhelmingly, I saw a poll the other night. I don't have it in front of me. I think it said something like 90% of Democrats have used, or Democratic women use or have used some form of pharmaceutical birth control, and something like 85 to 88% of Republican women also have used some form of pharmaceutical birth control. So I don't think the typical Republican voter even necessarily realizes that the Republican Party believes, because they say it's in any Republican platform that addresses abortion, and they all do. It will always say life begins at conception. If that is what they believe, then if you're on the pill, you got your little thing there that spins or whatever, and you take one of those out every morning, you got one for each day of the month, you're a baby killer as far as they're concerned, because you're preventing implantation. You're interrupting life. That life already started at conception. Now, I don't believe that. I think an argument, a much sounder argument, could be made that life begins at implantation, which, by the way, is what Newt Gingrich believes, and he's a conservative Republican. He says no. As far as he's concerned, life does not begin at conception. It begins at implantation. He's on record as saying that. So not everyone in the Republican Party who's active in the Republican Party believes this. But this does seem to be the official position of the Republican Party. Life begins at conception. So if you use the pill, you are a baby killer. You are a murderer as far as they are concerned. That is their official position. Sounds extreme, doesn't it? It is. But this is why they're doing everything they can to oppose birth control. Because they think if you use birth control, you're a murderer. You don't have to actually get pregnant and have an abortion to be a baby killer. You just use birth control, preventing getting pregnant, and you're a baby killer. That's what they believe. It sounds insane, but that is what they believe. If life begins at conception, then if you take the pill, you're a baby killer. If you use the morning after pill, you're a baby killer. And they play this game, by the way. They play this game where they talk about the morning after pill as though it were something that it's not. Because all the morning after pill really is an extremely high dose of regular birth control. It's just an elevated dose to make sure that implantation is prevented. Because you have a certain amount of time. It's obviously it's not an instant thing. Pregnancy doesn't just happen. So, but what they do is they talk about the morning after pill, and this is intentional. I caught on to this years ago. They know they're doing it. It is intentional. They talk about it as though it is the same thing as RU486, which is the abortion pill. Now, RU486 is also known as the abortion pill. Why? Because that actually causes an abortion. The morning after pill is not the same thing as RU486. It does not cause an abortion. It can't cause an abortion because you can't have an abortion if you're not pregnant. Oh, but they believe you are pregnant. As soon as conception has occurred, you're pregnant. So anything you do to intervene between conception and implantation, you're a murderer. That is what they believe. So if you're a female who happens to be Republican, just so you know, if you don't already realize it, your party, if you're on the pill, if you're or if you use an IUD or whatever, anything prescribed by a doctor that somehow interferes with the process, your own party thinks that you're a baby killer. They do. They believe using birth control is the same thing as having an abortion. It sounds insane, but this is what they think. And that's why Hobby Lobby doesn't want to include that in their insurance packages, because Hobby Lobby doesn't want their employees killing babies, because they honestly believe that that's what it does. Some of this, by the way, I think is just born out of ignorance. I have known in conversations with Christian conservatives that sometimes if I start throwing the word implantation in there and I'll say, well, do you believe that, are you sure that life begins at conception? What about implantation? This doesn't always happen, certainly, but I have had conversations with Christian conservatives where at the mention of the word implantation, I get a blank stare. I think that one of the reasons that conservatives have been so effective at conflating, for example, the morning after pill with the abortion pill is just they're just counting on people being ignorant and not actually doing any research or not actually stopping to think or question, wait a minute, are those the same thing? Because they're not the same thing. But they're counting on you being ignorant. They're counting on you not bothering to figure out or research or find out for yourself, ask your doctor, whatever, that they're not the same thing. This is kind of a funny thing I found on HuffPost. Oh, actually, so before we go on to this, let me just say this. I don't believe that pharmaceutical contraception causes an abortion. I think it prevents pregnancy, period. So I believe that the smart move for all the conservative Christians in the United States would be to say, you know what, maybe contraception should be available and affordable for everyone. Because if there's less unwanted pregnancy, hey, there'll be less abortion. Wow, imagine that. That would be the logical thing. But the reason they, as logical and common sense as that is, it's their attitude about it is why they will never accept it. Because, again, like I said, they believe if you use contraception, you're killing babies. Until they can get past that, they will never understand that encouraging people to use contraception will prevent unwanted pregnancy, therefore prevent abortion. All right, so anyway, so this was from HuffPost. Ryan Grimm wrote this. 8 other laws that could be ignored now that Christians get to pick and choose. So I'll read this quickly. It's relatively short, but the owners of a chain of stores called Hobby Lobby don't like Obamacare. In particular, they really don't like the part that requires insurance companies to cover contraceptives. Normally, people who don't like a law petition the government to change that law. That's how a nation of laws works. But these men are Christians. The Supreme Court ruled Monday that Christian business owners are special. Their deeply held religious belief that some particular form of contraception is immoral carries more weight than the force of law, 5 conservative Christian judges ruled. The court, in a fairly bald admission that its ruling is incoherent, added that no general amnesty from other laws should be assumed to be the result of its ruling and that its reasoning was strictly limited to women's contraception. Such a limitation raises legitimate questions about the rather perverted and obsessive minds of the 5 men who made the ruling, but it also carries little legal weight. Precedent is precedent, whether the precedent setters say so or not. As Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wondered about in her dissent, quote, would the exemption extend to employers with religiously grounded objections to blood transfusions, like Jehovah's Witnesses, antidepressants, like Scientologists, medications derived from pigs, including anesthesia, intravenous fluids, and pills coated with gelatin? Certain Muslims, Jews, and Hindus object to some of those things. As long as we're doing a la carte law abiding, here are a few additional ones that could become optional to certain people with deeply held beliefs. Nudity laws. Entire colonies of people are dedicated to the belief that being compelled to wear clothes is wrong. Others don't believe they should be compelled to make love only indoors. Don't want to see this on your Saturday stroll? Hey, freedom isn't free. Taxes. Most religions profess a deep affinity for peace while drenching history in blood in the name of religion, but whatever. Why should religious pacifists be compelled to pay taxes that subsidize war? Why should Randians, believers in Atlas Shrugged, the Bible, for dorm room free market evangelists, be forced to support the evil that is government? Next, we have LSD. There isn't much more religious of an experience than talking directly with God. Hell, Houston Smith included a section on acid in his definitive book, The World's Religions. While we're at it, all drug laws rub up against religious practice. Sorry, officer, this is our church. Next is growing hemp. If you've ever talked to a hemp evangelist, you know belief in the crop borders on the religious. Something we discussed recently on the show, stoning. The Bible is packed with tales of impure women meeting a just end under a pile of stones. Today, in certain countries, they're known as honor killings. Will the court make an exception to murder for the deeply religious? I almost don't want to read this one, but I will. Just kind of makes me cringe. Genital mutilation. Female circumcision, more commonly and accurately known as genital mutilation, is central to the practice of some religions, according to some people who have strong beliefs. What is a democracy to tell people otherwise? In fact, the same could go for domestic violence, polygamy, and whatever else. Pasteurized milk. For some Amish folks, following a strict religious interpretation of do unto others what you have others do unto you means selling raw, unpasteurized milk, a practice under U.S. law, for its potential to carry dangerous bacteria such as Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria. And finally, domestic violence. To hell with the Violence Against Women Act when the Quran authorizes you to strike a disobedient wife, as illustrated in chapter 4, verse 34. And we don't have to limit the freedom to Muslim men, as Deuteronomy 25:11 through 12 testifies, quote, if two men are fighting and the wife of one of them comes to rescue her husband from his assailant, and she reaches out and seizes him by his private parts, you shall cut off her hand. Show her no pity, unquote. So 8 more laws that Christians can just ignore, or other religious folks can just ignore if they want to. And another fun article I found, because this speaks to something I discuss a lot on this show. Longtime viewers and listeners have heard this all before, but just very quickly for the new, there's a sect of Christianity that I define as what I call ironic Christianity. And what an ironic Christian is, a Christian who pretends to believe in Christ and professes the teachings of Christ and quotes the Bible and goes to church and all that great stuff, while having as little to do with possible as anything Christ ever actually said. For example, Christ said, he among you who is without sin may cast the first stone. So what do ironic Christians love to do? They love to judge people. Christ was about taking care of the poor and not worshiping money and so forth. Well, ironic Christians, they're not really into that part of what Christ said. The longer I live and the more I observe, I try very hard to be respectful. I will never say all Christians are ironic Christians, because I know for a fact that not to be true. So I will often say some, or I will say many. I'm having a harder and harder time. The more I observe, the more I see in the world. I'm having a harder time not using the word most. I try not to say most Christians, but I don't know. Sometimes it really does feel like most Christians are ironic Christians. But some non-ironic Christians are actually calling out Hobby Lobby. This is also from HuffPost. Kim Basin writes this. Christians call out Hobby Lobby for hypocrisy. The arts and crafts retailer Hobby Lobby proudly touts itself as a Christian company that puts people over profits. No such thing. However, some staunch Christians say there's a gaping hole in that claim, namely China. Products bearing Made in China labels are found all over the shelves at Hobby Lobby, evidence that some of its wares come from Chinese factories that have a reputation for labor rights violations and rock-bottom wages. Employees at these facilities often end up working grueling hours in prison-like conditions and never earn enough to escape poverty. Christian author and columnist Jonathan Merritt wrote in a recent article for The Week, quote, "You cannot call your business Christian when arguing before the Supreme Court and then set aside Christian values when you're placing a bulk order for cheap wind chimes," unquote. Hobby Lobby remains quiet about its dealings in China. The company did not respond to requests for a list of Chinese factories it does business with and did not provide information about what the percentage of its merchandise comes from China. Then there's China's controversial record on abortion. It gets interesting here. The country's one-child policy was slightly relaxed in 2013, but the family planning bureaucracy still exists. Since the government instituted the policy 40 years ago, there have been more than 330 million abortions in China, according to health ministry data cited by the Financial Times. Though fewer instances of forced abortion, infanticide, and involuntary sterilization now occur because they're banned by the government, they still happen, the Washington Post reported last year. This week, Hobby Lobby's crusade against contraceptives scored a victory in the U.S. Supreme Court. On Monday, the court ruled 5-4 that so-called closely held corporations don't have to provide certain kinds of contraception for employees. Quote, being Christians, we don't pay for drugs that might cause abortions, which means that we don't cover emergency contraception, the morning after pill, or the week after pill, unquote, Hobby Lobby founder and CEO David Green wrote in an open letter in 2013, quote, we believe doing so might end a life at the moment of conception, something that is contrary to our most important beliefs, unquote. Again, that's just ignorant, by the way. Yet the company is happy to profit from the business it does with China, critics argue, even though political conditions in that country have led to hundreds of millions of abortions. Leslie Marshall, a radio host and self-described born-again Christian, questioned Hobby Lobby's policies in a column for U.S. News and World Report in March, invoking the teachings of, quote, the guy who started all of this, unquote. In other words, Christ, after whom Christianity is named, the very guy who ironic Christians really want nothing to do with. Marshall wrote, quote, as they say, what would Jesus do? He would remind Hobby Lobby that he that is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone. Hobby Lobby should put its stones down, unquote. In a 2013 blog post, Matt Chambers, the director of non-governmental organization called Safe World, similarly wrote that he disapproved of Hobby Lobby's relationship with China for religious reasons. According to the Christian Post, Chambers wrote, quote, you see, when it comes to carrying high the banner of biblical principles, I believe a company who wanted that to be their public persona would be extra careful to never do business with the very people who go against everything they claim to fight for as Christians, unquote. Other Christian columnists, including the Christian Post's Josh Stonestreet, have come out in defense of Hobby Lobby, saying that working with Chinese manufacturers is different from working with the Chinese government. He wrote, quote, doing business in a place where evil exists is not the same as directly supporting that evil. In fact, it may even be a force for good, unquote. Hobby Lobby has remained largely silent on the issue, but in a column in the Rutland Herald in March, Peter Dobelbauer, the company's vice president and chief legal officer, provided some insight into Hobby Lobby's rationale for buying products made abroad. Those factories can't control what their governments do, so it's okay. He wrote in response to an earlier op-ed calling for a boycott that appeared in the same paper. He said, quote, our company sources from suppliers around the world. Virtually all Hobby Lobby's vendors are small entrepreneurial businesses without control over their government's abortion policies, unquote. Well, it's not just about the abortion. It's also about the miserable working conditions, the way they treat these people. In these factories in China, they treat people very poorly. Some might think that treating people poorly would be un-Christian-like. But, of course, if you're an ironic Christian, like these people are, you don't give a crap about that. So, we have a little bit of time left. One more thing on the Hobby Lobby thing before we wrap up. I had some other topics, but I never get to all of them, as you know. Oh, okay. I've just been informed. I don't know if you guys can hear the voice behind me, but Inside Story is not doing a live show today, so I don't. I usually end about 5 minutes early to give them room, but maybe today I'll go to 2:58. Living large. So let me read this to you. Actually, a couple things here. Here's proof that the Hobby Lobby ruling is a slippery slope. This kind of works into what I was talking about before, the 8 laws that Christians might also be able to ignore. This is from the AP. Associated Press says here, the Supreme Court on Tuesday confirmed that its decision a day earlier extending religious rights to closely held corporations applies broadly to the contraceptive coverage requirement in the new healthcare law, not just the handful of methods the justices considered in their ruling. The justices did not comment in leaving in place lower court rulings in favor of businesses that object to covering all 20 methods of government-approved contraception. Oklahoma-based Hobby Lobby, Inc. and a Pennsylvania furniture maker won their court challenges Monday, in which they refused to pay for 2 emergency contraceptive pills and 2 intrauterine devices. Tuesday's orders apply to companies owned by Catholics who oppose all contraception. Cases involving Colorado-based Hercules Industries, Inc., Illinois-based Court and Luchohan Contractors, Inc., I probably butchered that, and Indiana-based Grote Industries, Inc. were awaiting action pending resolution of the Hobby Lobby case. They are among roughly 50 lawsuits from profit-seeking corporations that object to the contraceptive coverage requirement in their health care plans for employees. Contraception is among a range of preventative services that must be included in the health plans at no extra cost to workers. The justices also ordered lower courts that ruled in favor of the Obama administration to reconsider those decisions in light of Monday's 5-4 decision. 2 Michigan-based companies, AutoCam Corp. And Eden Foods, Inc., both lost their cases in the lower courts. The justices ordered that the 6th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals to reconsider its decisions against the companies. So this is all going to get complicated as what happens when precedent is set. And then there's a quick article here before we do run out of time. Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote a scathing 35-page dissent in the birth control case. So let me read this article. I'm not going to read the actual dissent, obviously. It's 35 pages, but I will read this very short article to you. The Supreme Court delivered a blow to universal birth control coverage on Monday, ruling that closely held corporations can refuse to cover contraception in their health plans for religious reasons. But Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg sharply disagreed with the 5 conservatives on the court, delivering a scathing 35-page dissent and defense of mandatory contraception coverage. Quote, in a decision of startling breadth, the court holds that commercial enterprises, including corporations, along with partnerships and sole proprietorships, can opt out of any law, saving only tax laws, they judge incompatible with their sincerely held religious beliefs. And again, that relates to what I was talking about before. You know, what else will they be able to opt out of for religious reasons? She said she feared that with its decision, the court had ventured into a minefield. The sharply divided justices ruled in Burwell versus Hobby Lobby Stores and Conestoga Wood Specialties versus Burwell that the provision in the Affordable Care Act that requires for nonprofit companies to cover contraception in their health plans imposes a substantial burden on their ability to exercise religious freedom. The Greens, a Christian family that owns Hobby Lobby, and the Hans, a Mennonite family that owns Conestoga Wood Specialties, believe that certain kinds of birth control are akin to abortion. The 5 conservative-leaning justices on the court sided with the religious companies and ruled that the government has to exempt them and other closely held corporations from having to include birth control coverage in their plans. The 3 remaining liberal-leaning justices, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Stephen Breyer, partially joined Ginsburg in her dissent. The burden of paying out of pocket for contraception is now unfairly shifted to women whose bosses' religious beliefs conflict with their own, Ginsburg said. An intrauterine device, a very reliable form of long-term contraception that is implanted into the uterus, is particularly expensive for women to have to pay for out of pocket. She wrote, quote, it bears note in this regard that the cost of an IUD is nearly equivalent to a month's full-time pay for workers earning the minimum wage, unquote. Ginsburg argued that religious corporations are not significantly burdened by having to include certain coverage in their health insurance plans. She wrote, quote, the requirement carries no command that Hobby Lobby or Conestoga purchase or provide the contraceptives that they find objectionable. Instead, it calls on the companies covered by the requirement to direct money into undifferentiated funds that finance a wide variety of benefits under comprehensive health plans, unquote. So if I understand that correctly, what she's saying there is that she's saying, look, it's not like Hobby Lobby it has to buy birth control for anybody. They're not directly involved in that. Further, Ginsburg wrote, a woman's decision to claim birth control benefits in consultation with her doctor is in no way compelled by her employer and is not equivalent to a moral action on the part of the employer. Quote, should an employee of Hobby Lobby or Conestoga share the religious beliefs of Greens and Hans, she is, of course, under no compulsion to use the contraceptives in question, unquote. Even if Hobby Lobby and Conestoga were substantially burdened by the requirement, Ginsburg argued, the government has shown that providing no-cost birth control to women is a, quote, compelling interest in public health and women's well-being. Those interests are concrete, specific, and demonstrated by a wealth of empirical evidence. To recapitulate, the mandated contraception coverage enables women to avoid the health problems unintended pregnancies may visit on them and their children, unquote. Ginsburg wrote that she believed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act had been enacted by Congress to, quote, serve a far less radical purpose than the court had interpreted it to. And mindful of the havoc the court's judgment can introduce, I dissent, unquote. So that is those are some parts of her dissent. By the way, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, that was supported by not only Republicans, but by Democrats, signed into law by Democratic President Bill Clinton. But I don't think any of them foresaw it being used in this manner some 20 years down the road. That's for sure. So we are just about out of time. So I do want to remind everybody, of course, that tomorrow, if you're watching live on Wednesday, same bat time, same bat station, I will be, I wonder if anyone under the age of 30 even gets that reference. I will be a guest on Jane King's show, New Earth Lifestyles. So looking forward to that, and looking forward to crossing my path with the lovely and talented Ginger Farrer. It's been a long time since I've seen her, so that'll be exciting. But also, of course, don't forget to Thursday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern on the Dr. Kevin Radio Network is the radio edition of Matt Connarton Unleashed. If you haven't seen it yet, there's a brand new site, dkrn.fm. Very, very cool new site for the Dr. Kevin Radio Network. Very excited about that. So I hope you will join me for that. We'll get into some stuff that we didn't get to today. I do want to talk about Dick Cheney. And when I say talk about, I mean ridicule him for some of the comments he's making lately about in regard to Iraq and that terrible, terrible situation there, which continues to get worse. This man who, with no apparent, speaking of no self-awareness, some of his criticism of Obama could easily have been said about himself or about Bush. It's just amazing. So join me tomorrow night for that. And of course, if you are watching on live on Wednesday, you know the routine by now. I'll be back at 4 o'clock with Norm, and I will be back at 6 o'clock with Gary. And that is it for now. I'm going to venture out into the heat and put some food in my stomach, so I'm ready for the rest of my broadcast day. So I'll see you back here in an hour with Norm. So thanks, everybody, and I'll talk at you a little bit later.